Matthew 26, beginning at verse 47. And while he was still speaking, behold, Judas, one of the 12, came up, accompanied by a great multitude, with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now he who was betraying him gave them a sign, saying, Whomever I shall kiss, he is the one. Seize him. And immediately he went to Jesus and said, Hail, Rabbi, and kissed him. And Jesus said to him, Friend, do what you have come for. Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus reached and drew out his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, Put your sword back into its place, for all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword. Or do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he'll at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? How then shall the Scriptures be fulfilled, that it must happen this way? At that time Jesus said to the multitudes, Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as against a robber? Every day I used to sit in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But all this has taken place that the scriptures of the prophets may be fulfilled. Then all the disciples left him and fled. We left off with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. What a study it was. Typically overlooked, rushed, and downplayed. We saw Christ as we've never seen him in Matthew's Gospel. His prayer to the Father revealed his suffering and the agony of his soul. There was a real struggle and sorrow, but Christ prevailed in prayer and submitted to the will of his Father. Christ is ready to endure his passion, and he is ready to die. Verse 47. And while he was still speaking, behold, Judas, one of the 12, came up, accompanied by a great multitude with swords and clubs from the chief priests and elders of the people. Before we really get into this, I want to say that I'm not attempting to harmonize the synoptics with John's account. I'll bring in some points from John to provide more details. As Jesus warns the disciples that his betrayer is at hand and orders them to arise, the betrayer is there. He has arrived. The betrayer is Judas Iscariot. Notice that Judas is described as one of the 12. He was one of this select group. Only 12 men followed Jesus and lived with him day in and day out during his public ministry. And Judas was one of those 12. Judas made his decision to make a deal with the enemies of Christ, and he led them right to Jesus. And what are they going to do? They're going to arrest him. They're not interested in debating any longer. They had attempted to trap Jesus many times. He, in his infinite wisdom, soundly defeated them every time that they tried to outsmart him, to trick him, to trap him. The religious leaders were fixed on destroying Jesus. Who made up this multitude? There were the chief priests, who were the Sadducees. There were the elders, who represent the people. There was a Roman cohort, which we read of in John 18:3, which was what could be up to about 600 men. Temple police, Luke 22:52, that were sent by the chief priests and Pharisees. Scribes and Pharisees had to be there as well. The Pharisees were the most consistent sect that was against Jesus, and the scribes were usually with them, and often many scribes were Pharisees. It was they he denounced in the Sermon on the Mount and the woes of Matthew 23. There's no indication in any of the Gospels that Judas knew for certain that Jesus and the 11 would be in Gethsemane that night. But as John writes, that Jesus and his disciples met there often. It took some time after Judas left to gather the multitude. It's likely that this may not have been the first place they searched for Jesus. He could have returned Judas to the upper room. And when I mean some time, we're talking about hours. Consider all that took place after Judas was dismissed by Jesus. The institution of the Lord's Supper, the teaching in the upper room, also known as the upper room discourse, that is included in John's Gospel alone. And then there was Christ's high priestly prayer. From there it was departing and arriving at the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus said to the disciples, "You could not watch with me for 1 hour?" They were there for a minimum of an hour. And looking at the timeline, a few hours had passed between Judas leaving to betray Jesus and now the arrest. It was quite an effort to assemble and round up this multitude, and it was late at night. Why were so many soldiers sent out to arrest Jesus? For one, the religious leaders for 3.5 years had failed to arrest Jesus. The clearing of the temple a few days earlier was fresh in their minds. The way in which he cleared out the temple with a holy zeal filled with righteous anger is beyond description and is without comparison. And Jesus was actually an intimidating man. The authority he spoke with was one thing. He had humiliated the religious leaders, scribes, and lawyers. When they attacked and set traps for Jesus, he responded and silenced his opponents, his critics. Second, Judas knew Christ spoke with authority, but he demonstrated that authority through his signs, wonders, miracles. Judas had witnessed far more than what we have recorded in the Gospels. And the religious leaders, the Sanhedrin, decided to leave nothing to chance. The 11 never expected Judas to be there with the crowd. They had no clue, no idea that Judas was betraying Jesus, and he was the traitor Jesus spoke of in the upper room. These men were caught by complete surprise. Stunning. Judas has his own unique place in history. There is a reason why no one names their child Judas. Judas equals traitor. The one that cannot be trusted. The one who stabs you in the back. And the worst of men. Verse 48. Now he who was betraying him gave them a sign, saying, "Whomever I shall kiss, he's the one. Seize him." Judas had agreed to give the enemies of Christ a sign. Seize the one I kiss. And this army of men at this time, they have invaded the garden to arrest God. That's what they've done. They went in that garden with all these weapons to arrest God. Verse 49. And immediately he went to Jesus and said, "Hail, Rabbi," and kissed him. Judas comes up to Jesus. "Hail, Rabbi." And Judas mocks Christ before Jesus' true disciples and this enormous multitude. To hail someone is to greet them, to salute them. He addresses Jesus as Rabbi, teacher, the title of respect. This is not only a teacher or simply Judas's teacher. This is the teacher, the wisdom of God, the greatest teacher, preacher, and man that has ever walked the earth. More than this, God the Son, the Lord. Judas has turned against this one, against Jesus, because he does not believe. He never believed. Judas is, as Jesus said, a devil, and he is evil to the core. Why the sign? First, it was dark. Second, among the disciples, visually, Jesus did not have anything special. There wasn't any distinct feature that set him apart from his disciples. He was an average looking man. Isaiah 53 teaches us that he had no outer beauty, the Messiah, ordinary appearance. Though it is not stated in the text, W.R. Downing makes the excellent point that you have to remember what Jesus had endured in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was sweating great drops of blood. His visage had changed. And this was not expected. Judas was unaware of this. Even Judas must have been taken back. So it was not as easy as you may think to try and identify Jesus. Judas kisses Christ. A kiss in our culture is to be between a man and a woman, reserved for your significant other or spouse. You don't go around kissing anyone. I've worked in other cultures and women will kiss you as a greeting. It's normal. And in that time, the Jewish culture at that time, it was not unusual for men to give a holy kiss. As Paul said, a kiss on a cheek, there's nothing wrong with that. It was a sign of affection and intimacy. The Greek, though, tells us that when Judas kissed Jesus, it was not quick. And this sinful traitor who hates Jesus kisses him repeatedly so the soldiers can't miss the sign. There'll be no question of who they will arrest. It's despicable. It's evil. It's disgusting. And this act of treason is against the holy and pure Christ, who had done nothing but good to Judas and was the most loving man that there has ever been or ever will be. And look how he's being treated here. Look how he's been treated his whole public ministry. And keep that in mind. Don't forget it with what is coming up. This is how they're treating God. Verse 50. And Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you have come for." Jesus calls Judas friend. And this is where our English translations fail again. MacArthur said, "We should understand this as not friend, rather fellow or comrade." There is no friendship here between Jesus and Judas. And Jesus is certainly not mouthing words, and he's not lying, and he is not in any way being dishonest with Judas. The only one here who is deceitful is Judas. Jesus could have called him out for what he has done. Imagine if this was someone, anyone other than Christ. What would be the response? How could you do this to me? Another man could attempt to strike Judas or strangle Judas. Not Christ. In the midst of the madness, and it is with all of these men who have filled this garden, religious leaders, priests, soldiers, police, guards, the disciples, and Judas are all there with Christ. It's as if time stops here and Jesus says what he needs to say to Judas, and that he says what he needs to say to Peter. Christ is calm. Why? He submitted to the will of God. He will carry out his mission, and he has already suffered in the garden. There is no turning back now for him. Thy will be done. Christ is in control and at peace with the sovereign will of God. Do what you have come to do. Judas is out of the moral will of God, but at the same time, he's accomplishing the decreed will of God. Listen, while this is true, Judas in no way will get off the hook for betraying Jesus. Previously, I offered reasons why Judas betrayed Jesus. He rejected Jesus as the Messiah. He was an unbeliever. Being a disciple was a lost cause. His time was being wasted, and before it was too late, he had to profit in some way for being connected with Jesus. But this is all from the human perspective. What does the Word of God say? He was the chosen betrayer. Jesus chose Judas. It was God's sovereign will that Judas would betray Jesus. Yet he is still morally responsible for his actions. Then the men laid hands on Jesus and seized him. At that moment, the disciples had to be in disbelief. They could not believe their eyes. Why? Because this group, the enemies of Christ, had never been able to lay hands upon Jesus. The only group that came close to actually harming Christ was those at Nazareth that attempted to push him off the cliff. But that was years earlier. He miraculously escaped. Remember when the religious leaders had attempted to arrest him in John 7? The officers responded to the chief priests and Pharisees, "Never did a man speak the way this man speaks." That very week in Jerusalem, it did not happen. This time, it was different. Jesus intimidated his enemies in every way, intellectually superior to them. He was the wisdom of God. Jesus walked on water. He calmed the storm. He cast out demons. He raised the dead. He's God. Now Jesus is giving himself up. The religious leaders finally have him. Verse 51, and behold, one of those who were with Jesus reached and drew out the sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. One of the disciples draws his sword and strikes the high priest's servant. And in doing this, he cuts off his ear. And John identifies that disciple as Peter. The servant's name is Malchus. Verse 52, and Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword." Jesus commands Peter to put his sword away. And I'm not choosing to comment further on the use of the sword. At this point, nearly every man will say, Peter was not a skilled swordsman. He was a fisherman, and that's why he only struck the ear. He missed him almost by a mile. Can we consider the possibility that Malchus tried to avoid getting hit? If a man is swinging a sword at you, you won't stand there as a statue. So what is Jesus saying here to Peter and the other disciples? The lesson is, as a disciple of Jesus, we do not live by the sword. We do not advance the kingdom by force. Our battles are not won with physical weapons, but with spiritual weapons. Please do not misunderstand that this does not mean we cannot defend ourselves. What you cannot do is call Peter a complete coward. Initially, he attempts to defend and fight for Jesus. The disciples are completely outnumbered, and the Roman soldiers and temple police are there. Verse 53. Jesus says, "Or do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels?" So Peter has lost sight of what Jesus has warned them. He doesn't understand. Jesus predicted this would happen. Again, they did not understand. They did not understand until after. It was actually God's sovereign will that they not understand at this time. Luke 18:34. Yet, I say again, they're still responsible for their actions. So Jesus stops time here because everything is on his terms. What needs to be said to whom it will be said at the appointed time will be said. In the midst of this crowd of hundreds of men, Jesus says, "Peter, understand that I can ask my Father to send more than 12 legions of angels to destroy my enemies." And it was estimated that there could be approaching 1,000 men that went out to arrest Jesus. Well, how much is 12 legions? 72,000 angels. In fact, again, he says, more than that are available. How do you respond to that? Verse 54. How then shall the scriptures be fulfilled that it must happen this way? What is at the forefront of the mind of Christ? Not a way of escape, not to fight back. The scriptures must be fulfilled. It all must take place. In other words, it has to go down like this. And there's no response from Peter. You can't argue with that. Verse 55. At that time Jesus said to the multitudes, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as against a robber? Every day I used to sit in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me." Jesus addresses the multitudes. And let me say this here and now, that I hate, yes, hate how Jesus has been portrayed over the years, especially in film, during his final hours. He's a weakling. And I'll say this again, Lord willing, in the future studies. This is not what we read in Scripture. Jesus says what he needs to say and nothing more. Jesus says, you have come after me as if I was a criminal, a revolutionary, a terrorist. From the perspective of the religious leaders, Jesus was evil, and they did what they could to convince the Romans that Jesus was a real threat, a revolutionary, an insurrectionist. The soldiers had swords and clubs. Jesus had taught in the temple throughout that week, and they did not arrest him. They saw him as he was, the perfect man, the righteous one. And he's approached like this. He's a teacher. He's not a warrior. Verse 56. But all this has taken place that the scriptures of the prophets may be fulfilled. Then all the disciples left him and fled. All this took place that the scriptures of the prophets may be fulfilled. Don't forget it as we are in this difficult and heavy section. What is to come must take place. It cannot be any other way. Then all the disciples fled. And please take notice, it says all the disciples. Peter's bravery was short-lived. Same with the other 10. What did their words of commitment to Jesus mean now? Their lives flashed before their eyes. Standing before them in the garden was hundreds of soldiers and angry men. They had been called out in the early hours of the morning to arrest this Jesus. And they were prepared to arrest whoever stood with him. Why the change in Peter and the disciples at this time? They saw that Jesus was not defending himself. Earlier, Peter and the others thought that Jesus would overcome them. Remember back to John's Gospel, when the multitude fell to the ground, he had the power to overcome all of them. Now that he chose not to do so, and they're actually going to take him away, Peter and the disciples realize this has gone south fast and we're all in deep trouble. Disciples were not ready to be persecuted. But instead of criticizing them, instead of dropping the hammer on them, would you have acted differently if you were facing the prospect of physical suffering and death? Would you have remained with Jesus or ran? Think about that when you're in your nice, comfortable, padded pews and seats on Sunday morning. Really, would you have acted differently? They were not ready to suffer. They were not ready to die, so they ran for their lives. Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the Holy One, is arrested alone and led out of the garden.